Brooklyn in the early 30s has a particular kind of quiet, late at night. Not silence, never silence, not here, but a settling. The clatter of a fire escape ladder as someone climbs home from a late shift. A dog barking 3 streets over. The low, tired groan of a radiator that has given everything it has and still isn't enough. And somewhere in that sound, somewhere between the brick and the lamplight and the cold draft coming off the East River, there is a boy walking home alone. You already know him. Small, thin-shouldered. A bruise on his jaw from a fight he didn't start and certainly didn't win. Steve Rogers, 14 years old, with a head full of convictions and a body that can barely carry them. And on this particular evening, walking home through the last gray light of a Tuesday in Hell's Kitchen, he does not yet know that everything is about to change, that the most important person in his life is about 6 blocks away and closing fast. But we are not there yet. Let the evening settle a little longer. The thing about Steve Rogers, before Bucky, is that he was not lonely in the way people might expect. He was alone, yes. His mother worked long shifts at the hospital and came home smelling of carbolic soap, too tired to do much more than heat soup and hold him close for a moment before sleep took her. His father was a photograph on the mantelpiece and a name on a headstone he visited once a year. The apartment was small and drafty, and the walls were thin enough that you could hear Mrs. Kowalski singing hymns in Polish next door. But Steve filled the silence with drawing. Pencil stubs, worn down to nothing. The backs of envelopes, margins of newspapers, the blank spaces in old-school exercise books. He drew the rooftops from his window. He drew the man who sold chestnuts on the corner of 9th Avenue. He drew his mother's hands. And in the drawing, there was a kind of company, a conversation between what he saw and what he could make of it. Steve was alone, but he was not empty. Still. There's a difference between being alone and having someone who stays. It happened on 10th Avenue, the way most things happened to Steve Rogers in those days. Suddenly, and with fists. There were boys who had claimed that stretch of sidewalk. Older, bigger, the kind of kids who had figured out early that the world rewarded size and volume. They charged a toll for crossing. A nickel, a candy bar, whatever you had. Most kids paid. Most kids looked at their shoes and handed it over and kept walking, because that was how you got home in one piece. Steve did not pay. You can picture it, if you like. The alley behind a grocer's shop. The smell of rotting cabbage and old brick. 3 boys, maybe 4, circling a kid who weighs less than any one of them. And that kid, jaw set, fists raised in a stance that is more stubbornness than technique, saying something along the lines of, no, just no, not today. They hit him. Of course they hit him. And he went down, and he got back up, and they hit him again, and he got back up again. And this is the part that mattered. Not the fighting, but the standing. Each time he rose, he was saying something without words, something that would echo through every decade of his life, though he did not know it yet. And that is when another boy came around the corner. James Buchanan Barnes was taller than Steve, broader, with dark hair and an easy grin, and the kind of confidence that comes from knowing your body will do what you ask of it. He had been walking home from somewhere. School, maybe, or an errand, and he heard the sounds of a fight in the alley. That was not unusual. Fights happened. Kids minded their own business. But Bucky stopped. Later, years later, decades later, People would ask why. Why that fight? Why that kid? And the answer was always the same, though Bucky said it different ways at different times. He was tired of watching bigger kids steal from smaller ones. He was tired of the boys who thought the world belonged to them because they happened to be large. But mostly, he stopped because of what he saw when he looked into the alley. Not a victim, not a boy being beaten, a boy who was losing and refused to admit it, a boy who was already bleeding and had his fists up anyway, as if the outcome of the fight was beside the point entirely. That was the thing that made Bucky Barnes stay. He waded in. He was good at this. Quick hands, natural balance, the kind of kid other kids thought twice about pushing. The bullies scattered. One of them caught a parting gift from Steve himself, who had picked up a circular trash can lid and swung it with more determination than aim. The bullies ran. The alley went quiet. Two boys stood in the gray light, breathing hard, looking at each other. Bucky introduced himself. Steve wiped blood from his lip and did the same. And that, as simply as that, was the beginning of the most important friendship in Steve Rogers' life. No ceremony, no grand moment. Just two kids in an alley in Hell's Kitchen, one of them grinning and the other one trying very hard not to grin back. They walked home together. Bucky asked Steve if he always fought guys twice his size. Steve said, only when they deserved it. Bucky laughed, a real laugh, surprised and warm, and Steve decided that maybe this was a person worth knowing. He was right. What follows is the kind of friendship that grows so naturally, it becomes difficult to remember a time before it existed. Bucky and Steve. Steve and Bucky. The names begin to travel together, spoken as a pair by neighbors and shopkeepers, and the long-suffering teachers at George Washington High School, where Steve enrolled in 1932, and Bucky was already holding court with the easy charm of a boy who would never have trouble making friends, but had chosen, for reasons known only to himself, to make this particular one his priority. They were different in almost every way that could be measured. Bucky was athletic, sociable, comfortable in his own skin. Steve was small, asthmatic, prone to fevers and heart trouble, and the kind of stubborn silences that drove authority figures to distraction. Bucky could talk his way into a dance hall. Steve could barely talk his way past a cold. But there was something between them that went deeper than similarity, a kind of mutual recognition, as though each boy saw in the other the piece of himself he was missing. Bucky gave Steve confidence, not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the knowledge that someone was in your corner, not because they had to be, but because they wanted to be. And Steve gave Bucky something harder to name. Purpose, maybe. Direction. The sense that standing up for something mattered, even when it cost you. Bucky had always been brave, but Steve taught him what to be brave about. They spent their days the way boys in Brooklyn spent their days. Stickball in the street until the light failed. Afternoons on the stoop, sharing a newspaper, arguing about baseball, walking the neighborhood in summer when the heat turned the asphalt soft and the whole block smelled of laundry drying on lines strung between windows, sitting on the fire escape at night, watching the lights of the city flicker and hum, saying nothing, saying everything. And then there were the adventures, the kind that seem enormous when you are young and become, in memory, even larger. There was the day at Coney Island, for instance. Bucky had been talking about the cyclone for weeks, the great wooden roller coaster that rattled and screamed along the boardwalk like a living thing. Steve had no interest in roller coasters. Steve had no interest in anything that might make his already unreliable body betray him in public. But Bucky had a way of making things sound inevitable, and so they went. The cyclone was everything Bucky promised, and everything Steve feared. The climb was slow and terrible, the wooden track groaning beneath them, and then the drop, the stomach-lurching, howling, merciless drop. And Steve closed his eyes and gripped the bar and made a sound he would later deny making. When it was over, he stumbled off the ride, found a rubbish bin, and threw up, while Bucky laughed so hard he had to sit down. Steve declared he would never ride it again. Bucky said he absolutely would. Neither of them was wrong. And there was the other Coney Island trip, the one with the hot dogs and the freezer truck. They had taken the train out with just enough money for the day, which should have been fine, except that they spent every last cent on hot dogs first. Bucky then compounded the problem by spending $3, $3 entire dollars, an outrageous sum, trying to win a stuffed bear at one of the boardwalk games. The bear was for a girl named Dolores. He did not win the bear. Dolores never knew about the $3, which was probably for the best. With no money left for the train home, they found themselves walking the service road behind the boardwalk until Bucky spotted a freezer truck making deliveries. They rode in the back, huddled between crates of ice cream, shivering and laughing and pretending they were not freezing to death. Steve's teeth chattered for an hour afterwards. Bucky called it the best day of the summer. These are the memories that matter, not because anything important happened in them. No battles, no turning points, no moments that would be written about in history books. They matter because they are the texture of a friendship, the proof that before Steve Rogers was Captain America, before the Shield, before any of it, he was just a kid from Brooklyn who had a best friend and a life that, despite its hardships, held warmth. Hold on to that warmth. It will be needed later. Steve's mother, Sarah, was the quiet center of his world. A nurse who worked long hours and came home tired and never complained. She had her husband's photograph on the mantel and her son's drawings on the wall, and a cough that had been getting worse for longer than she admitted. Tuberculosis. That was the word the doctors used, and it moved through the tenements like a draft under a door. Everyone knew someone. Everyone had lost someone. The hospitals were full of it, and Sarah Rogers worked in those hospitals, and the disease found her the way it found so many. Quietly, patiently, without mercy. Steve watched her decline through the autumn of 1936, watched her grow thinner, watched her wrap herself in blankets she could not seem to get warm beneath, watched her smile at him and tell him she was fine in a voice that both of them knew was lying. He drew her portrait during those last weeks. The sketch still existed somewhere, years later. Sarah Rogers in a chair by the window, light on her face, her eyes looking at something beyond the frame. She died in October. She was buried next to Joseph Rogers, a husband she had outlived by nearly 2 decades, in a cemetery that Steve had visited only once a year and would now visit far more often. A father he never knew on one side of the earth, a mother he knew too well and lost too soon on the other. The funeral was small. Brooklyn funerals were. The neighbors came, and the women from the hospital, and Bucky stood beside Steve through the whole of it without saying a word, because some things do not require words. just presence, just the steady warmth of someone standing close enough that your shoulder touches theirs. Afterwards, in the apartment that was now Steve's apartment and no one else's, Bucky made his offer. Come stay at his place, do some errands, earn his keep. It was practical, sensible, the obvious thing to do. A boy of 18, orphaned, with health problems, and no money, and an apartment he could barely afford. Of course, he should move in with his best friend. Steve said no. He said it the way he said most things, quietly, firmly, with a stubbornness that was either admirable or infuriating, depending on your perspective. He could get by on his own. He would manage. He always managed. Bucky watched him fumble with his keys at the front door, watched him search his pockets, pat his coat, frown at the lock as though the keys might materialize through sheer determination. And then Bucky reached into his own pocket and produced a key, Steve's spare, which he had been carrying without Steve's knowledge, because that was the kind of friend Bucky Barnes was. The kind who planned ahead. The kind who knew that Steve Rogers would never ask for help, and so made sure help was already there when he needed it. He pressed the key into Steve's hand, and then he said the words that would come to define everything, not just their friendship, but Steve's entire life, every choice he would make, every stand he would take, from Brooklyn to the ice to the far side of the universe and back again. I'm with you to the end of the line. 6 words, spoken quietly on the doorstep of a cold apartment on a gray October evening by a boy who meant them completely. Steve looked at him and nodded because there was nothing else to say, and Bucky nodded back, and neither of them knew, could not possibly have known, how far that line would stretch, or what it would cost them to follow it. But they would follow it, both of them, all the way to the end. The years between Sarah's death and the war are quieter in the telling, not because nothing happened, but because what happened was the slow, steady work of becoming. Steve enrolled at Auburndale Art School in 1937 and stayed through 1938, studying line and form and composition, learning to see the world with the careful attention of someone who draws it. His professors noted his talent. His classmates noted his size. He kept his head down and his pencils sharp, and produced work that was, by all accounts, genuinely good. There is something worth pausing on here. Steve Rogers, the boy who would become a soldier, was first an artist. His hands, before they held a shield, held charcoal. His eyes, before they scanned battlefields, studied the way light fell across a tenement rooftop at dawn. The sensitivity that would later make him a leader, the ability to see people, truly see them, to understand what they needed and what they feared, that came from the drawing, from the hours spent watching, from the practice of looking at the world not as it was, but as it could be rendered, honestly and with care. He was not a soldier yet. He was a kid with convictions, and a sketchbook, and a best friend who dragged him to baseball games and dance halls and all the places a boy in Brooklyn was supposed to go. The Dodgers were playing at Ebbets Field. The bands were playing at the Roseland Ballroom. The city hummed with a kind of desperate, beautiful energy, the way cities do when they know, somewhere beneath the surface, that the world is about to change. Steve drew. Bucky danced. The seasons turned. And then one December morning in 1941, the seasons stopped. They were in art class when it happened. Steve was drawing, something careful, something involving the line of a rooftop against winter sky. And Bucky was beside him, probably talking, because Bucky was always talking. And then someone came in with the news. Pearl Harbor. The Japanese had attacked the naval base in Hawaii. The radio reports were confused and overlapping and terrible, and by the time the full picture emerged, the world Steve and Bucky had known, the world of Coney Island and baseball games and lazy afternoons on the stoop, was gone. The United States of America was at war. Steve wanted to fight. Immediately, viscerally, with every fiber of his being. The same impulse that had put him in that alley on 10th Avenue, that had made him stand up to every bully who crossed his path. It flared in him now, brighter and fiercer than ever. There were men with guns pointed at the world, and Steve Rogers could not sit still while that was happening. But his body said no. The asthma, the heart trouble, the fevers, the list of ailments that followed him like a shadow. None of it had changed. Steve was still 5'4" and 95 pounds, and the kind of thin that made doctors wince when they listened to his chest. Bucky, understanding both the wanting and the impossibility, did what Bucky always did. He helped. He took Steve to Goldie's boxing gym and trained him for 2 weeks. Footwork, guard, how to throw a punch that started from the hips instead of the shoulder. Bucky was patient, and Steve was determined, and neither of them talked about the fact that no amount of boxing was going to change what the medical examiners would see when Steve stood in front of them. They went to the U.S. Recruiting and Induction Center together. Steve filled out the forms. The doctor examined him, looked at his chart, and stamped it with a classification that would become the most familiar word in Steve's vocabulary. 4F. Unfit for military service. Bucky enlisted that same day. Steve tried again and again. Different offices, different cities. He went wherever there was a recruitment center that might not have seen his file. He even used false papers once, claiming he was from Paramus, New Jersey, a place he had never been. It did not matter. The answer was always the same. The doctors looked at his chest x-ray and shook their heads, and Steve walked out into the street and started looking for the next office. 5 times. 5 rejections. Each one a door closing in his face, and each time Steve turned around and walked to the next door and knocked again. And then there was the cinema. By June of 1943, the rejection had settled into Steve like a stone, heavy, immovable, familiar. The war was everywhere now, in the newspapers and the radio broadcasts, and the empty chairs at dinner tables across Brooklyn. And Steve Rogers was still here, still home, still watching from the wrong side of the ocean. On this particular evening, he had gone to the pictures to take his mind off it, the way people do when the thing they want most is the thing they cannot have. The newsreel played before the feature. Footage of the war. Soldiers shipping out. Factories retooling. The president asking every American to do their part. Steve watched it the way he watched everything to do with the war, with a kind of fierce, aching attention, as though he could will himself onto those transport ships through the sheer force of wanting it. And then the man in the row behind him started talking, loud, dismissive, telling the screen to hurry up and play the movie, telling the soldiers on screen that nobody cared, telling the room, essentially, that none of it mattered. Steve told him to be quiet. You know what happened next. The man was bigger, considerably bigger, the kind of bigger that makes most people reconsider their position. Steve did not reconsider his position. Steve rarely reconsidered his position. The man took him outside into the alley behind the theater and began to make his point with his fists. It was, by any reasonable measure, not a fair fight. Steve went down. He got up. He went down again. He picked up a garbage can lid. The same instinct, the same gesture, the same circular shield-shaped improvisation that had appeared in that very first alley fight years ago, and held it in front of him like it might make a difference. It did not make much of a difference. The man knocked him down again, and Steve, on his knees, bleeding, looked up and said the words, the ones that lived in him like a heartbeat, steady and constant and impossible to silence. I can do this all day. He meant it. That was the thing. He always meant it. Bucky arrived, as Bucky always arrived, at precisely the moment Steve needed him most. The bully took one look at Barnes in his uniform and decided the evening was over. He left. Bucky helped Steve to his feet, brushed the dirt off his jacket, and looked at him with an expression that was equal parts exasperation and love. Steve noticed the uniform. Bucky confirmed it. He was shipping out with the 107th Infantry Regiment. Tomorrow. To England. The war that Steve could not join was taking his best friend across the ocean. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, Bucky insisted, they were going to have fun. The Stark Expo glittered like a promise. Howard Stark, a name that would come to mean a great deal more to Steve in time, though he did not know it yet, had built a vision of the future in the middle of New York, and the whole city had come to see it. There were lights everywhere, pavilions and stages and contraptions that looked like they had fallen out of a science fiction magazine. The air smelled of popcorn and engine oil and possibility. Bucky had arranged a double date. This was news to Steve. Bonnie and Connie, two girls who waved at Bucky with the kind of enthusiasm that suggested he had been charming on their previous meeting. Steve asked, with the resigned air of someone who already knew the answer, what Bucky had told his date about him. Bucky said he had told her only the good stuff, which did nothing to settle Steve's nerves. They walked the expo together, the four of them, and Steve tried to enjoy it. He tried to watch Howard Stark demonstrate a flying car prototype, a sleek, impossible thing that actually lifted off the ground for a few shimmering seconds before the technology failed and the whole apparatus crashed back down with a sound like a piano falling off a roof. The crowd laughed. Stark, to his credit, laughed with them and promised the future was merely running a little behind schedule. Steve offered Connie some sweets. She declined. He could feel the evening slipping away from him, not because it was bad, but because his mind was somewhere else entirely. It was in the enlistment office he had visited that morning, where a doctor had looked at his chest X-ray and shaken his head. It was in the newspaper headlines that screamed about Normandy and North Africa and places where men were fighting and dying while Steve Rogers stood in a queue and was told, again, that he was not enough. And then he saw it, adjacent to the expo, tucked between pavilions like an afterthought, a recruitment office. A cardboard soldier stood by the entrance, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing the uniform Steve wanted more than anything in the world. Steve stepped up beside it. The top of his head barely reached the cardboard soldier's chin. He slipped away from the group without a word. Bucky found him, of course. Bucky always found him. Steve was waiting in line, filling out another form, telling another set of lies about his medical history. Bucky's expression, the one he wore when Steve was being particularly, magnificently unreasonable, settled into place like a familiar coat. He tried to talk Steve out of it, pointed out, reasonably, that lying on a federal enlistment form was a crime, that Steve could be arrested, that there were other ways to serve, other ways to help, other ways to be part of this thing without putting his name on a piece of paper that would eventually be checked against his medical records and found wanting. Steve listened. Steve always listened to Bucky. And then Steve did exactly what he was going to do anyway, because listening and agreeing were, in Steve Rogers' world, two entirely separate activities. He told Bucky he had no right to do any less than the men who were laying down their lives, that there were people out there fighting and dying, and he could not sit in Brooklyn and watch, not when he had two hands and a heartbeat and a willingness to use both. Bucky looked at him for a long moment, and then he stopped arguing. They said their goodbyes the way soldiers and their friends said goodbyes in 1943, with joking insults and a hug that lasted a beat longer than either of them would have admitted. Bucky was shipping out in the morning, the 107th Infantry Regiment, England, and then wherever the war took him. The last thing Steve saw was Bucky walking away through the crowd, his uniform catching the light from the expo signs, and then the crowd swallowed him, and he was gone. Steve stood alone in the recruitment office. The forms were filled out. The lies were told. And somewhere in the back of his mind, the familiar weight of certainty settled. He would be rejected again, classified 4F again, sent home again to his empty apartment and his sketchbooks and the radio reports of a war that did not want him. But that is not what happened. A man was watching, had been watching, in fact, for some time. An older man, with round glasses and a kind face, and a German accent that should have made Steve nervous, but somehow didn't. He had overheard the conversation between Steve and Bucky. He had heard the desperation, and the conviction, and the stubbornness, and he had recognized something in it. Something he had been looking for. Abraham Erskine stepped into the examination room where Steve was sitting on a table, his shirt off, his ribs visible, his shoes untied. Steve saw him and assumed the worst, that his false paperwork had been discovered, that the authorities had finally caught up with him, that this was the arrest Bucky had warned about. It was not an arrest. Erskine introduced himself. He represented something called the Strategic Scientific Reserve, which meant nothing to Steve at the time, but would come to mean everything. He looked at Steve's file, the long, damning list of ailments, the multiple rejections, the stubbornness that had brought this frail young man back to the enlistment office again and again and again. And then he asked a question. "Do you want to kill Nazis?" Steve paused. It was, he understood, a test. Not a medical test. Those he had failed many times. A different kind of test. The kind where the answer mattered more than the question. He could have said yes. It would have been the easy answer, the expected answer. The answer that any young man burning to join the war effort might give without thinking. But Steve Rogers did not give easy answers. He gave honest ones. "I don't want to kill anyone," he said. "I just don't like bullies, no matter where they're from." Erskine looked at him, really looked at him, past the thin chest and the bad lungs and the medical chart that said this boy should not be here. He looked at what was underneath all of that, at the thing Sarah Rogers had seen when she told her son his heart was 10 times his size, at the thing Bucky Barnes had seen in an alley on 10th Avenue when a smaller kid refused to stay down. And he smiled. He told Steve about a program, an experiment, a chance. Not a guarantee, not a promise, but a chance to become the soldier he wanted to be. Project Rebirth, he called it. Steve's ticket to the war. Steve said yes before Erskine had finished explaining. Of course he did. And so the door opened. Quietly, without fanfare, in a small examination room in a recruitment office attached to the Stark Expo, while the lights of the future glittered outside and the sounds of the crowd drifted in through the walls. A door that Steve Rogers had been knocking on for years, through 5 rejections, through false papers and failed physicals, and the steady, grinding humiliation of being told, again and again, that he was not enough. The door opened, and behind it was everything. But that is for later. For now, let the moment rest here. Let Steve sit on that examination table with his shoes untied and his heart full, and the first real hope he has felt in years settling over him like a blanket. Let him hold Erskine's words in his mind. Not the details of the program, not the science, not the risk, but the simple, extraordinary fact that someone looked at him and said yes. Outside, the expo is winding down. The lights are dimming, one pavilion at a time. Somewhere on a troop ship heading east across the Atlantic, Bucky Barnes is leaning on a railing, watching the New York skyline shrink against the horizon, thinking about the friend he left behind. He does not know that Steve has found his way in. He does not know what is coming. None of them do. The city settles. The sounds of Brooklyn fold inward, a taxi horn fading into the distance, the murmur of a radio through an open window, the soft percussion of rain beginning to fall on fire escapes and rooftops and empty stoops. October rain, cold and steady, the kind that washes the dust from the streets and leaves everything clean. Steve Rogers walks home through it. He does not hurry. The rain does not bother him. It never has. Not really. He is thinking about Erskine's offer, turning it over in his mind the way he might turn over a drawing that is not quite finished, looking for the shape of what it will become. He is thinking about Bucky, already on the water, already gone. He is thinking about his mother's voice, years ago, telling him that his body was fragile, but his heart was not. And somewhere beneath all of that, beneath the thinking, beneath the hoping, beneath the quiet, steady drumbeat of a young man's determination, there is a feeling he cannot quite name, a sense of something about to begin. The last night of the old world, and the first night of whatever comes next. The rain falls. The city sleeps. And Steve Rogers, walking home through Brooklyn with his collar turned up and his hands in his pockets, allows himself, just for a moment, to believe that he might be enough after all. Tomorrow, everything changes. But tonight, the rain is gentle, and the streets are quiet, and the boy from Brooklyn is still just a boy from Brooklyn, carrying the key Bucky gave him, and the promise that came with it, to the end of the line, however far that turns out to be. Let the rain carry you forward gently. There's more to tell, a laboratory, a transformation, a war, but all of that can wait. For now, rest here, in the sound of the rain and the warmth of the memory, and know that the story continues whenever you are ready to hear it. Continuity note. For now, rest here in the sound of the rain and the warmth of the memory, and know that the story continues whenever you are ready to hear it.